I spent my life savings on a $485,000 home for my son, only to be banned from dinner before the ink was dry. Now I'm using the 30-day legal window to take it all back and teach him a lesson he'll never forget. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The leather folder on my passenger seat felt like a lead weight, even though it represented the proudest moment of my life. I had just walked out of the notary office on Central Avenue with 20 pages of legal text that shifted $485,000 of my hard-earned retirement into a future for my son, Michael, and his wife, Jennifer. 5 years of eating frozen dinners, driving a beat-up pickup truck, and skipping every fishing trip to Alaska had led to this signature. I drove north on the I-10, the Arizona sun turning the Phoenix skyline into an impossible blue, feeling like I had finally won at being a father. I pulled into the Whole Foods parking lot on Camelback Road, ready to drop a few $100s on the finest Thanksgiving ingredients because, for the first time in a decade, I felt like the provider I was meant to be. I was comparing yams, smelling the wet earth of the produce section, when my phone buzzed with a message that made the world tilt. "Dad, I know you just bought us the house, but my mother-in-law doesn't want you coming to Thanksgiving dinner," the text from Michael read. "Jennifer thinks it's better this way. We'll see you another time." I stood there, surrounded by families arguing over pie fillings and turkey sizes, feeling my pulse spike against my ribs. I typed out a response about the $35,000 wedding I paid for, the $15,000 car loan he never touched, and the $12,000 in furniture Jennifer insisted on, but my thumb hovered over the delete key. Around me, the store was loud with the sound of happy preparation, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I looked at the leather folder through the windshield of my truck, a trophy that had suddenly turned into a tombstone for my dignity. I typed one word, "fine," and sent it before the air in my lungs gave out completely. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes, the Arizona heat beginning to bake the interior while I stared at the notary's seal. Patricia, a woman I had never even met, had decided I wasn't welcome in the house I had just purchased with my life savings. The folder mocked me, a stack of $485,000 in generosity that hadn't even bought me a seat at the table. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the screen protector on my phone cracked, a spiderweb of glass spreading across the notification of Michael's missed call. He was calling now, likely to offer a weak apology or a rain check for a Tuesday night in December. I didn't answer. I looked at the legal clause the notary had mentioned in passing, something about a 30-day waiting period before the transfer was permanent. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The house wasn't theirs yet. It was still mine, held in a legal limbo that required 30 days of good faith to finalize. I started the engine, the rumble of the truck vibrating through my boots as I shifted into reverse and left the Whole Foods parking lot without a single yam. I drove past the neighbors hanging inflatable turkeys and wreaths, feeling like a ghost in my own community. I went home, bypassed the kitchen, and went straight to my office where the records of 30 years of running gray construction were filed. I didn't need a holiday meal. I needed the paper trail of every cent I had ever bled for a son who wouldn't stand up to his mother-in-law. I pulled out the accordion file that Jennifer used to laugh at, calling me a hoarder for keeping every receipt and canceled check. I laid them out on the desk under the harsh light of my desk lamp. $8,000 for credit card debt in 2018, $5,500 for medical bills in 2021, and the $15,000 car loan from 2023. The total, when I ran it on my old school calculator, hit $230,000 in documented help, not including the house. I read the house transfer documents again, my eyes locking onto the phrase material change in circumstances. The notary's voice echoed in my head, explaining that the gift was revocable under certain conditions of gross ingratitude. I pulled up my laptop and began searching for the best contract attorney in Phoenix, my jaw locked tight. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as I drafted an email to Harrison and Associates, the firm that handled the sale of my company. I attached the scanned deeds and the screenshot of the text message that had ended my relationship with my son. I wasn't the ATM anymore. I was a creditor, and the debt was about to be called in with interest. I looked at the photo of Michael on my desk, taken at his graduation, and felt a coldness settle into my marrow that no Arizona sun could warm. By 3 in the morning, I had a plan that would do more than just cancel a house closing. I would show them exactly what life looked like when the man they treated as a resource finally walked away. I woke up at 7 to the sound of Michael calling again, his name pulsing on the screen like a warning light. I let it ring 4 times before picking up, keeping my voice as flat as a desert highway. "Dad, look about yesterday. He started with that forced cheerfulness he used when he wanted something. Patricia is just particular about holidays, and Jennifer is stressed." I cut him off, telling him I understood perfectly that my mother-in-law, a stranger, was the new authority in the house I bought. I asked him about the $15,000 for the car and the $8,000 for the bills, and I heard the silence on the other end grow heavy. He tried to claim they were gifts, his voice rising in panic, but I told him I was reconsidering everything before hanging up. I spent the rest of the morning organizing the folders into categories: loans never repaid, gifts never acknowledged, and promises never kept. I saw the day warm into the 70s through my window, but I stayed in the shadows of my office, fueled by the ritual of grinding coffee beans and stacking evidence. By 10, I had an appointment with Robert Chen for 2 p.m. the following day. I wasn't just taking the house back, I was preparing to dismantle the comfortable life they had built on the back of my silence. I walked out to my truck, the leather folder back in my hand, and realized the 30-day window wasn't just a legal time frame, it was a countdown to their total financial collapse. Robert Chen's office on the 12th floor of the glass tower on Central Avenue smelled of expensive leather and old money. He sat across from me, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he reviewed the text message I had printed out in large, clear font. He tapped a pen against his legal pad, looking at the $485,000 deed and then at the spreadsheet of $230,000 in additional loans. "You're talking about Section 25211, he said, his voice echoing in the sterile conference room. "Gross ingratitude is a high bar, Stanley, but being uninvited from the home you just purchased for them before the ink is even dry is a textbook example." I didn't smile. I just signed the revocation papers in the same blue ink I had used to give the house away 3 days prior. The irony of the pen felt like a sharp jolt in my hand as I slid the documents back across the mahogany table. "I want every loan memorialized," I told him, my voice steady. "The wedding, the furniture, the car, the credit cards." Robert nodded, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to tactical focus. He told me the revocation would be filed with Maricopa County by the end of the day, and a certified letter would be sent to Michael's office by morning. I walked out of the building and into the bright Phoenix afternoon, feeling the first stirrings of a different kind of power. I wasn't the helpful dad anymore. I was a litigant and my evidence was airtight. 2 days later, the quiet of my truck was shattered by my phone buzzing against the center console. Michael's voice was a mix of rage and genuine terror when I finally answered. "Dad, what is this?" he screamed, the concrete walls of the parking garage amplifying his panic through the speakers. "A revocation of gift? You can't do this. We already told everyone at work. Jennifer's parents already saw the house." I leaned back against the seat, feeling the cool air of the AC hit my face as I told him he had poor planning. "You chose her mother over your father," I said, "and I'm just correcting my mistake." Jennifer grabbed the phone then, her voice dripping with a venom I had never heard before, calling me a manipulative old man. "You think money means you own us," she hissed, but I had my spreadsheet open on the dashboard. I read back the $35,000 wedding, the $15,000 car, and the $12,000 in furniture, asking her exactly what they had contributed to the relationship. "We included you in our lives," she claimed, a statement so hollow it felt like a physical weight in the truck. I disconnected the call before she could respond, the silence of the garage rushing back in. I sat there for 20 minutes, feeling the emptiness where my relationship with my son used to be, a gap that felt like a pulled tooth. The house was the opening move, but the loan repayment demand for $35,000 was the killing blow that would arrive by the end of the week. The certified letter hit their doorstep on a Saturday morning, and I could imagine the scene without being there. Jennifer tearing the envelope open while Michael ran from the shower, only to find a formal demand for $35,000 due in 60 days. Robert called me to confirm delivery, asking if I was sure about being this aggressive. Cornered animals bite, Stanley, he warned, but I told him that was exactly the point. My phone became a barrage of voicemails that evening, Michael pleading about their $2,400 rent and Jennifer's Lexus payment. By the third message, the tone shifted to threats of suing me for emotional distress, claiming Patricia's lawyer friends were ready to fight. I deleted the threats with a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing Robert's documentation was locked tight. On Monday, Robert called back with a chuckle, telling me their attorney had laughed them out of the office. They had no case, no standing, and no way to stop the revocation. On Wednesday evening, I saw headlights sweep across my living room window and watched Michael's Honda sit in my driveway for 40 minutes. He didn't come to the door. He just sat there in the dark, staring at the house of the man he had discarded. When he finally drove away, I went back to my desk and opened a new tab in my spreadsheet. Phase 2, the social ladder. I met Thomas Wright at a diner off the I-10 on Thursday morning. Thomas had been my foreman for 15 years and still bowled in the same league as Michael. Over steaming coffee, he told me he had seen them at Costco with Patricia, and the fight was loud enough for half the store to hear. Jennifer was screaming at Michael to control his father and fix the mess, while Patricia called me a miser and a control freak. I listened, my heart hardening with every word, realizing that Patricia wasn't just an annoying mother-in-law. She was the architect of the betrayal, and Jennifer was her willing apprentice. I told Thomas the simple truth. I bought them a house, and then I changed my mind. As I drove home, I realized I had been looking at the wrong enemy. Jennifer was the face of the problem, but Patricia was the poison in the well. I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed her name at the top. Patricia Morrison. I needed to know who was pulling the strings in my son's marriage, her history, her finances, and her motives. People who manipulate that effectively always leave a trail of wreckage behind them. I called Robert and asked for the name of a private investigator who didn't ask questions. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was done being a victim of a family I had built with my own hands. The coffee shop in Tempe was filled with the hum of college students and the smell of burnt espresso when Marcus, the investigator, slid a manila folder across the table. He didn't order a drink, he just pointed at the business closure notice for Morrison's elegance. Patricia Morrison was 58, divorced, and had failed spectacularly in the boutique clothing business a year prior. She owed $38,000 to suppliers and $22,000 on personal credit cards, and she had been evicted from her condo in Chandler. She had been living with Michael and Jennifer for 18 months, rent-free, a parasite disguised as a house guest. I opened the folder further to find the text messages Marcus had recovered from a shared cloud account. "Your father-in-law is loaded." One text from Patricia to Jennifer read, "Make him pay for the house. Old men need to be useful, or what's the point?" I felt my jaw ache from clenching as I read 2 years of manipulation laid out in black and white. Patricia had positioned me as an enemy long before the Thanksgiving text, convincing Jennifer that my money was a debt I owed them for the privilege of their company. I paid Marcus his fee and a bonus, the folder sitting on my passenger seat like a loaded weapon. That evening, I sent 2 texts to my late wife's siblings, Sarah and David, asking them to come for dinner on Tuesday. I needed the family to see the autopsy of a betrayal. Tuesday night, I served a simple pot roast, the kind my wife used to make, while Sarah and David sat in a heavy silence. After the plates were cleared, I opened the laptop and showed them everything: the house revocation, the loan demand, and Patricia's financial records. Sarah, who had watched Michael grow up, didn't cry out of sadness. She was trembling with fury. She had seen Jennifer change, but hadn't realized a bankrupt manipulator was living in their spare room, poisoning the well for 2 years. Sarah pulled out her phone right there at the table and called Michael, her voice echoing through the house as she told him the whole family knew about Patricia's debts and his cowardice. The social pressure began to build like water behind a dam. Over the next 3 days, my phone stayed quiet, but Thomas Wright sent me screenshots of the fallout. Jennifer had been removed from the family Facebook group, and old photos of past Thanksgivings were being reposted with captions about the meaning of loyalty. I didn't gloat. I just watched the ledger of their reputation go into the red. On Friday, Sarah called to say Michael had reached out to her, sounding quiet and broken, asking if she really thought he had treated me that badly. She had told him his mother would be heartbroken, and he had hung up without a word. The truth was out, but the $35,000 debt was still looming. By the following Monday, the first rejection letters from banks started arriving at Michael's apartment. I knew this because Thomas had seen Jennifer at a coffee shop, surrounded by paperwork and a calculator, looking defeated. Their debt-to-income ratio was too high, and with the house revocation hitting the public record, no bank would touch them for a personal loan. They had $4,800 in savings and a $35,000 hole in their lives that was about to swallow them whole. I sat in my office and watched the sun set over the valley, knowing the deadline was only a week away. Desperation has a specific smell, and it was starting to waft from their direction. Inside their apartment, the atmosphere had turned toxic. I learned later from Sarah that Jennifer had spent the night calculating their way out of a problem with no mathematical solution. Michael had suggested selling the furniture and Jennifer's Lexus, but Jennifer had snapped, demanding he borrow more from me. Patricia sat in the living room, still pretending she had friends who could help, making phone calls that everyone knew were fake. When Jennifer finally realized her mother was a fraud with nothing but excuses, the first crack in their alliance appeared. "You have debts and excuses," Jennifer had screamed, and Patricia had retreated into the spare room she didn't pay for. The next morning, Jennifer posted her Lexus on every sales platform she could find, the price $4,000 below market value. She was desperate, and the buyers knew it. On Tuesday afternoon, I saw Michael's Honda in the parking lot of my construction office at 2:47 p.m. He sat there for nearly 3 hours, windows up, staring at the entrance. I didn't go out. I reviewed bids, took phone calls, and finished my workday as if he wasn't there. When I finally walked to my truck at 5:30, he got out of his car with the posture of a man who had already lost everything. "Dad, please just hear me," he said, his voice cracking in the evening air. I didn't get out of my truck. I just rolled the window down and kept the engine running. I told him we communicated through Robert now, and when he pleaded for a payment plan, I reminded him he had 60 days and chose to spend 3 weeks panicking. I told him he was my son when he excluded me from Thanksgiving and when he let Patricia manipulate him, but now he was just a debtor. I rolled up the window and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the empty parking lot. The deadline was Friday, and I knew they were still $13,000 short. Friday morning arrived with the cold finality of a court date. I sat at my desk with the phone on speaker, Robert Chen on the other end, waiting for the wire transfer notification. At 3:47 p.m., the alert chimed. $30,000 had hit my account. They hadn't made the full amount, but they had bled themselves dry to get that close. Michael's email arrived minutes later, sounding like a hostage negotiation, promising the remaining $5,000 in 30 days. I called Robert and told him I wanted a formal loan agreement for the shortfall, 8% interest, 12-month installments made legal and binding. I wanted it to be impossible for them to ever forget the cost of their choices. I learned from Thomas that Jennifer's parents had provided the final $10,000 after a brutal confrontation. Her father had set the check on the counter without even looking at her, telling her he was ashamed of how they had treated family like an ATM. They had borrowed from friends who insisted on promissory notes, effectively ending those friendships in the process. They had sold every piece of furniture that wasn't a necessity, cased every CD, and shredded every safety net they had. They were $30,000 lighter and had lost every ounce of respect they possessed in the Phoenix community. Sunday morning, the situation with Patricia finally detonated. Jennifer had found her mother's suitcase in the hallway, and something inside her snapped. The screaming match lasted 20 minutes, accusations of manipulation and parasitic living flying like shrapnel through the thin apartment walls. Jennifer had realized her mother's approval was worthless compared to the life she had just lost. "You moved in rent-free and turned me against Stanley," Jennifer had screamed, and Patricia had shot back that they would end up alone and broken. The door slammed so hard the frame cracked, and Patricia was gone, leaving behind a daughter who finally saw the wreckage of her own making. Late that night, Michael and Jennifer sat in their stripped-down living room, an empty wall where the designer console had been. Michael had finally admitted that I was right about everything, and they sat in the silence where certainty used to live. On Monday morning, the DocuSign notification for the $5,000 loan hit Michael's phone. He signed it at his kitchen table, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the legal language that formalized his status as a debtor. I received the signed agreement by 10 a.m. and saved it to my legal folder. The transformation was complete. He wasn't a son receiving help. He was a client fulfilling an obligation. 6 weeks of monthly payments followed, each one arriving exactly on schedule, automatic and impersonal. The money didn't matter to me, but the ritual did. Thomas kept me informed, telling me they looked rough at the grocery store, buying generic brands and losing stress weight. The fancy lifestyle was dead, and Michael's reputation at work had shifted from the rising star to the cautionary tale who had screwed over his own father. Everyone in their small circle knew the story now. On a Wednesday afternoon in early December, a certified letter from Patricia arrived at my house, filled with wild accusations of financial elder abuse and threats to report me to Adult Protective Services. I read the 3 pages of aggressive capital letters and called Robert, who laughed at the desperation. He drafted a cease and desist that highlighted her own bankruptcy and fraud history, promising legal consequences if she ever contacted me again. I filed her letter in a folder labeled Morrison Harassment and never thought about it again. She was noise, a dying ember of a fire I had already put out. Then, on Thursday evening at 8:47 p.m., an email arrived from Michael with the subject line, "No excuses." I opened it to find a raw, plain acknowledgement of his failures. "Dad, I understand we were wrong," he wrote. "Not just about Thanksgiving, but about the years of taking without appreciating." He didn't ask for money, he didn't offer justifications, and he didn't try to minimize what they had done. He simply said, I deserved better than the son he had been. I read it 3 times, noticed the lack of manipulation, and then I closed my laptop. I didn't respond. I let the silence do its work for 3 days, letting him sit with the uncertainty I had lived with since that November afternoon. On the 4th day, I drove out to a mountain overlook north of Cave Creek to think. I sat on my truck's tailgate for 3 hours, staring at the Sonoran Desert. The question wasn't about forgiveness, it was about whether I was willing to risk the peace I had found. Engaging with him meant reopening wounds that had finally started to scar over. You deserve better than the son I've been. The line kept echoing in my head. A hawk circled overhead, patient and strategic, and I realized that forgiveness didn't mean a return to the past. It meant a new set of rules for the future. I drove back to Phoenix and waited another 2 weeks before I sent a single word. Tuesday afternoon, I was at my construction office when Michael's Honda pulled into the lot at 2:15 p.m. He sat there for 20 minutes, no phone in his hand, just waiting. I watched him from the second-floor window and saw a man who had been stripped of his entitlement. I decided to face the conversation, but I propped the conference room door open to maintain professional distance. When I appeared in the lobby, Michael looked smaller, the confidence that used to armor him gone. "Dad, thank you for not turning me away," he whispered. I gestured toward the room and told him he had 5 minutes. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the tile. Michael sat across from me and laid it all out. The years of treating me like an ATM, the cowardice of not defending me, and the arrogance of believing he deserved my money without my respect. He admitted he was angry at first because I had exposed the truth he was avoiding. He told me he realized he had become someone his mother would be ashamed of. I asked him if the change was because of the consequences or the understanding, and he began to cry. Real tears that came from a place of genuine loss. "You're my son," I told him, "but letting you continue using me would have been cruelty to both of us." He asked for forgiveness, and I told him that trust isn't rebuilt with apologies. It's rebuilt with consistent actions over time. I told him if he wanted a relationship, he had to earn it, 1 month at a time, with no grand gestures and no dramatic promises. He nodded, telling me Jennifer was in counseling with him, working on the damage Patricia had done. I told him this was his last chance, that at 62 I didn't have time for cycles of betrayal. I stood up and offered a handshake, not a hug, and invited him for coffee the following week. I watched him walk to his car, his shoulders less burdened, and felt a sense of possibility rather than hope. Coffee the next week was the test. 3 weeks of gradual reconnection followed, 2 coffee meetings and 1 lunch where the conversation was measured and careful. There was no mention of money, only the reality of their new life and the lessons they were learning in the shadows of their failures. Finally, Michael invited me to their apartment for dinner, a meal Jennifer would cook, with Patricia explicitly excluded from the invitation. The apartment complex was worn, and Michael's Honda was in a standard spot, the Lexus long gone. I climbed the stairs carrying nothing, no wine, no gifts, no olive branches. Jennifer answered the door with genuine warmth and visible nervousness, and the interior of the apartment told the story of their fall. IKEA furniture sat where designer pieces used to be, and the walls were blank. We sat at a folding table with mismatched plates, eating a simple roasted chicken. Midway through, Jennifer set her fork down and apologized for the years of taking advantage of my love. She told me she had traded my respect for her mother's approval, and that her mother's approval had proven to be worthless. Michael added that I had taught him strength by walking away, showing him that dignity means setting boundaries. I listened to the silence that followed my warning, that this was their final opportunity, and that any slip back into old patterns would mean a permanent exit from my life. That silence, the way they digested the weight of my words, convinced me more than any promise ever could. They understood the stakes now because they had lived through the loss. We talked about lighter topics after that, and I mentioned I had bought a small cabin in the mountains near Prescott. I told them it was a place for people I trust, and that while trust was still being rebuilt, it was possible they might see it someday. Michael shook my hand at the door, promising to prove he was worth having as a son. I told him I had given up on the son he was, and was meeting the son he was trying to become. As I drove home through the quiet Phoenix streets, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a restored dignity that no amount of money could buy. I had updated my will to include trust conditions that would protect my legacy from future exploitation. The cabin was my refuge, a symbol of my reclaimed autonomy, and the monthly dinners would be the new rhythm of our lives. Patricia was gone. Jennifer was no longer under her influence, and Michael was learning to be a man. I had learned the hardest lesson a father can learn, that sometimes love means walking away, and that dignity means deciding who is allowed to walk back. The mountain air in the cabin would be clear, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the silence. The transition from a father who provided everything to a father who demanded respect was a shift that vibrated through every interaction. I sat in my office exactly 1 month after the first repayment, watching the digital ledger. The clock on the wall read 5 p.m. when the notification pinged. Another $450 had been deposited. There was no celebratory text from Michael, no check-in from Jennifer, just the cold, hard math of a debt being honored. It was the first time in 10 years our relationship felt balanced, not because of the money, but because the silence meant they were finally doing the work instead of talking about it. I decided to test the new boundaries by visiting Michael at his workplace, a mid-sized marketing firm in Scottsdale. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to see the man who existed when he didn't have time to prepare a face for me. When I walked into the lobby, I saw him through the glass partition of a small conference room. He wasn't the lead presenter anymore. He was taking notes while a younger colleague spoke. His suit looked slightly loose, his face thinner from the stress of a year spent paying for his own mistakes. When he saw me waiting by the elevators, he didn't look for an exit. He walked over, offered a firm handshake, and suggested a quick walk to the park across the street. The February air in Arizona was crisp, but the sun was starting to bite. We sat on a concrete bench near a fountain that drowned out the traffic. I asked him how the $450 monthly payment was affecting their budget. He didn't complain about the $2,400 rent or the missing Lexus. He simply told me they had learned to appreciate the difference between a need and a want. He mentioned that Jennifer had taken a part-time job as a receptionist to help cover the $5,000 loan shortfall. It was the first time I heard him speak about his wife working without a tone of resentment or victimhood. Before we parted, Michael reached into his bag and pulled out a small, worn envelope. It wasn't money. It was a handwritten invitation to a small birthday dinner for him the following week. "Just the three of us again," he said, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that felt new. No Patricia, no big production, just a home-cooked meal in the apartment we're slowly making our own. I took the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper, and realized this was the first time in years he was asking for my time without mentioning my wallet. I drove home past the luxury condos I used to dream of buying for them, feeling a strange sense of relief that those dreams had died. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a news alert about a local fraud investigation. I thought of Patricia, wondering where she had crawled to after the cease and desist landed on her doorstep. I checked my documentation folder one last time before bed, seeing the green cells on the spreadsheet growing. The leverage was still mine, but the tension was shifting from financial to emotional. I went to sleep thinking about the mountain cabin, wondering if the air up there was finally clean enough for guests. The morning of the birthday dinner, I stopped at a local hardware store, not a florist. I bought a high-quality set of basic tools and a heavy-duty toolbox. It was a gift of utility, not luxury, a subtle reminder that they were now responsible for fixing what broke in their lives. I arrived at the apartment at 6 p.m. sharp. The smell of roasting garlic and onions filled the hallway. When Jennifer opened the door, she wasn't wearing the designer jewelry I'd seen in old photos. She was wearing a plain apron and a tired, genuine smile. The dinner was quiet. The conversation focused on Michael's new project at work and Jennifer's success at the dental office where she worked. But as the evening wound down, Michael's expression shifted. He cleared his throat and looked at the empty spot where their designer television used to sit. "Dad, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Patricia reached out to Jennifer yesterday from a burner phone. My pulse spiked as I gripped the edge of the folding table. She isn't just gone, she's desperate, and she made a threat that involves the notary you used." The silence in the room became heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a collapse. I looked from Michael to Jennifer, searching for a trace of the old manipulation, but I saw only fear. Patricia had claimed she had proof that the notary, Amanda Foster, had been coerced into filing the house revocation. It was a lie, a desperate attempt to claw back some form of leverage. But in the world of legal filings and public reputation, even a lie can be a wildfire. I stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor like a serrated blade. I asked Jennifer exactly what was said on that burner phone. She told me Patricia wanted $10,000 to disappear, or she would take her story to the local news and the Secretary of State. She called it a whistleblower fee. Jennifer had recorded the last 30 seconds of the call on her tablet. We sat around the small kitchen table as the tinny, distorted voice of Patricia Morrison filled the room, calling me a predatory old man and Michael a weak-willed puppet. The mask was completely off. The parasite was now a predator. I didn't panic. 30 years of construction taught me that when a structure is failing, you don't pray, you reinforce the beams. I called Robert Chen right there from the dining table. I told him we had a recorded extortion attempt and a threat against a bonded notary. Robert's voice was cold and professional as he told me to bring the recording to his office at 8 a.m. I looked at Michael and Jennifer and saw the test I had been waiting for. They had been given a chance to side with the money again, to ask me to pay her off to make the problem go away. Instead, Michael stood up and grabbed his coat. "I'm going with you," he said. Jennifer stayed behind to transcribe the recording, her hands steady as she worked the laptop I had once wanted to take away. We drove to the glass tower on Central Avenue through a night that felt charged with electricity. For the first time, Michael sat in the conference room not as a defendant, but as a witness for the prosecution. We spent 4 hours with Robert and an associate drafting a criminal complaint for extortion and harassment. The following morning, we met with Amanda Foster, the notary. She was a small woman with a spine of tempered steel. When we told her about the threat, she didn't flinch. She provided her logbooks and a signed affidavit confirming that the revocation was handled with 100% compliance. We were building a cage for Patricia, and every piece of evidence was a new bar. By noon, Robert had contacted the Scottsdale Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The trap was set, and all we needed was for Patricia to make one more call for the whistleblower fee. The call came at 2 p.m. while we were all gathered in Robert's office. Robert signaled for Jennifer to answer and put it on speaker. Patricia's voice was arrogant, demanding to know if the $10,000 was ready for pickup at the designated drop-off behind a grocery store in Mesa. Jennifer, following Robert's script, confirmed she had the money, but needed to know that the notary story would be buried forever. Patricia laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone, and promised that once she was paid, she would leave the state and never look back. We watched from a distance as plainclothes officers waited at the Mesa drop-off. I sat in the back of my truck with Michael, both of us watching the clock on the dashboard. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows over the desert landscape. At 5:15 p.m., a silver sedan pulled into the lot. A woman in an oversized hat and sunglasses stepped out, her movements frantic and jittery. She reached for the package left behind the dumpster, and the world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Then, the officers moved in, and the architect of my family's misery was finally in handcuffs. The fallout of Patricia's arrest was a quiet storm that cleared the air for good. The local news didn't get a whistleblower story. They got a report on a failed extortion plot by a bankrupt boutique owner. I sat in my office with the final police report, feeling the weight of the last year finally start to lift. The $5,000 loan was now down to $3,200, the payments arriving like clockwork. Michael and Jennifer had survived the ultimate test. They had chosen justice over comfort, and in doing so, they had finally earned a seat at my table. I decided it was time to reveal the mountain cabin. I invited them for a Saturday morning drive, not telling them the destination. We headed north, the desert scrub giving way to the tall pines of the Prescott National Forest. The air up there was 20 degrees cooler and smelled of resin and damp earth. When I pulled into the gravel driveway of the small cedar-sided cabin, Michael and Jennifer stayed silent for a long time. It wasn't a mansion, but it was solid, honest, and entirely mine. We spent the day clearing brush and stacking wood for the fireplace. There were no speeches about forgiveness, just the shared rhythm of physical labor. Jennifer worked alongside us, her hands getting dirty as she helped move the heavy stones for a new fire pit. As the sun dipped below the peaks, we sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, watching the first stars appear in a sky that felt wider than anything in Phoenix. Michael looked at the horizon and said he finally understood why I had built a construction company from nothing. It wasn't about the money. It was about the pride of seeing something stand. I told them the cabin would be a shared space now, but only as long as the respect we had built remained the foundation. I explained the trust I had set up, which would ensure that if anything happened to me, the property would stay in the family, but would be protected from creditors or outside influence. Jennifer thanked me, not with the gushing entitlement of the past, but with a quiet nod that suggested she understood the gravity of the gift. We had moved from a house bought with retirement money to a home built with reclaimed trust. The drive back to the valley felt shorter than the trip up. We stopped at a roadside diner for a late dinner, laughing over a shared plate of fries like a real family for the first time in a decade. When I dropped them off at their apartment, Michael gave me a hug that didn't feel like a transaction. He told me he was up for a promotion at work, one that would allow them to finish the $5,000 loan 6 months early. I told him I didn't care about the speed of the money, only the consistency of the man. I went home and looked at the photo of my late wife on the mantle. I felt like I could finally look her in the eye again. I had saved our son not by giving him what he wanted, but by forcing him to become who he needed to be. I opened my laptop and marked the final legal fees for the Patricia case as paid in full. The ledger was almost closed. I walked out onto my back patio and listened to the Arizona night, feeling the peace of a man who no longer had to hide his records or his heart. The next morning, I received a text from Michael with a photo of the new tool set I had given him. He had used the wrench to fix a leaky pipe under their kitchen sink. "Fixed it myself," the caption read. "No plumber, no loan, just work." I smiled, the first genuine smile that reached my eyes in a year. But then my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a number from the county jail. My finger hovered over the screen as the automated voice informed me of a collect call from an inmate. I didn't press one to accept the call. I let the automated voice trail off into silence, and then I blocked the number for good. Patricia Morrison was a ghost haunting a cell, and I had no more room for ghosts in my life. I deleted the notification and put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. My life was no longer a series of reactions to her manipulations. It was a series of choices made for my own peace. I made a fresh pot of coffee, the smell filling the house that had once felt too large and too empty. The following month, the final $450 payment arrived, accompanied by a simple note: "Debt satisfied, respect earned." I closed the spreadsheet for the last time, but I didn't delete it. I moved it to an archive folder, a digital monument to the year I stopped being a victim. Michael and Jennifer came over that weekend, not to ask for help with a rough patch, but to help me paint the guest bedroom. We worked in a comfortable silence, the only sound the rhythmic roll of the brushes against the wall. During a break, Michael told me they had decided to stay in their apartment for another year to build up a real emergency fund. He said they didn't need a $485,000 house to be happy. They just needed a home they could afford on their own. Jennifer mentioned she had been promoted to office manager, and she was finally paying back the $10,000 she owed her own father. The cycle of entitlement had been broken, replaced by a cycle of responsibility that stretched across two families. I looked at them and realized that the 30-day revocation window had been the best gift I ever gave. It hadn't just saved my money, it had saved my son's character. We finished the painting by sunset, the room now a clean, neutral white, ready for whatever the future held. I realized then that my house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a sanctuary where the rules were clear and the love was earned. We sat on the back porch and watched the Phoenix lights flicker on, a sprawling grid of millions of people each trying to find their own way. Michael asked if I would be interested in going on that Alaska fishing trip we had talked about years ago. He said he had been saving his own money for it, and it would be his treat this time. I felt a lump form in my throat, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of closure. I told him I'd love to go, as long as he handled the bait. We laughed, a sound that felt as solid and real as the mountain cabin, and I knew then that the restoration was complete. I've learned that being a father isn't about how much you can give, but about how much you can teach. It's about knowing when to open your wallet and when to close your door. I stood up and walked to the edge of the patio, looking out at the desert I had called home for 30 years. The ledger was balanced, the boundaries were set, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I was just living. I walked back inside to join my family, leaving the dark Arizona night behind me. The table was set for 3, the mismatched plates a reminder of where we'd been, and the warmth of the room a promise of where we were going. I picked up my fork and smiled at my son, knowing that while the house I bought was gone, the home we had built was here to stay. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below. Even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.